Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture on Chapter 9. I am going to record Chapter 9 in two parts. It's not an excessively long chapter, but I'm just going to divvy it up into two shorter lectures here. So please make sure to watch both Part 1 and Part 2 of the Chapter 9 lecture. So in Chapter 9, we're continuing our conversation about micronutrients. And in Chapter 9, we're going to focus specifically on micronutrients that function as electrolytes. And because electrolytes work so closely with fluid in the body to maintain fluid balance, this will also be the part of our course where we talk about water in greater depth. We will talk a little bit more about water when we get into the physical activity lecture, I think in Unit 4. But this will be where we talk about water. So just kind of like recapping back to Unit 1, when we said that there are 6 categories of nutrients. We said that we have protein, carbohydrate, and lipid. Then we said we have vitamins, minerals, and water. So we've already talked about protein, carbohydrate, and lipid in our macronutrients unit. And now in this unit, we're talking about primarily vitamins and minerals, being the 2 categories of micronutrients. And then water, you might recall, I said that water doesn't necessarily fit into either group of micronutrients or macronutrients. So this is where water gets placed. So just make note of that, because water is arguably our most essential nutrient. So we'll talk more about that coming up. Alrighty, so let's start with just a little kind of introduction to this concept of body fluids at all. So body fluid is just referring to any of the liquid portions of our body. So we talked a little bit about how the inside of our cells has kind of a fluid-like substance called cytosol. We didn't say much about it, but when we talked about metabolism, and especially like glycolysis, we said that some steps of metabolism, like glycolysis, can happen in the cytosol, and they don't actually happen in the mitochondria. So yeah, a lot of our bodies, you also know, the common, I think, fun fact is that the majority of our bodies are actually fluid or water-based. So about 50 to 70% of a healthy adult body by weight is fluids, or we could say water. So we do have quite a lot of fluid substance in our bodies. And then blood may be one of the more obvious ones. Blood is clearly a fluid. So just kind of when we say fluid balance, this is kind of what we're talking about, is how do we balance the fluid that's inside of our cells? How do we balance the fluid that's in our blood? How do we balance any of the fluid-like nature of our digestive organs and any of the secretions that our digestive organs make to do digestion, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about here, is how does the body regulate the fluid that is so critical to body function. Fluid, by definition, is kind of defined, as being distinct from solid. Something that is fluid is able to move freely and changeably, and will adapt to the shape of its container, right? So that's just sort of basic definition of fluid. So important to know here, there are lots of different, not lots, but there are different ways that we can sort of categorize or define fluids in our bodies. So 2 major ways of talking about fluid. We can talk about intracellular fluid, and we can identify extracellular fluid. So again, here's a place to not necessarily try to memorize something, but to just understand what the words are telling you. So intra, usually meaning like inside of. Intra means something that's inside of something. So intracellular means it's inside of a cell. So intracellular fluid is fluid that's inside the cell. And this makes up the majority of the fluid in our bodies. About 2/3 of this 50 to 70% weight, 50% 50 to 70% of our body weight being fluid, 2/3 of that fluid is found intracellularly, is found inside of our cells. And then we can talk about extracellular fluid. So extra meaning like in addition to, or sort of overflowing, right? So extracellular is outside of something. So extracellular is outside the cell, extracellular. And extracellular fluid accounts for about 1/3 of the total fluid in our bodies. Now, extracellular fluid, we can further kind of define extracellular fluid in 3 ways. Intracellular fluid is pretty straightforward. It's just inside of a cell. But extracellular, there's a lot of extracellular space in the body, right? There's a lot of space outside of cells. So we can kind of be more specific in talking about extracellular fluid. So we could say that extracellular fluid could be interstitial fluid. So think about like the interstate, right? The interstate highway or the interstate thruway. What does that mean if it's an interstate? Right? Is it intra? Is it inside of one state? An interstate goes between 2 different states. So interstitial fluid goes between different cells. It's fluid that goes between different cells that are of a particular tissue or organ. So like your muscle cells, for example. If you have think about, you know, your bicep or your quadricep, these larger muscles and even smaller ones, but just think about your muscle. It's made up of hundreds, thousands of different cells. And so the fluid that is outside of those cells, so extracellular, and surrounding specifically those muscle cells of that one muscle, that's interstitial. So it's fluid that is surrounding cells that make up one specific tissue or organ. And then we can say that extracellular fluid could be intravascular fluid. So again, just look at what that word means. Same as we saw up here, intra, so meaning inside of, but it's not intracellular, it's intravascular. So it's fluid that is inside of some sort of vessel, right? So in this case, the 2 major vessels in our bodies are blood vessels and lymph vessels. So intravascular is fluid that's inside of either a blood vessel or a lymph vessel. And then we can also say that extracellular fluid could be plasma. And plasma is specific to the blood. So plasma, we will talk more about blood coming up actually in this unit. But plasma is, we could also say, the fluid portion of blood specifically. So we're going to find plasma in any of our blood vessels. So major arteries, major veins, smaller arteries, arterioles, venules, and of course within the capillaries too. So please be able to identify these 3 different types of extracellular fluid, and please also understand intracellular versus extracellular fluid. This might have been helpful actually to have that whole time. So here's the visual representation of intracellular versus extracellular. Right, so if this is a cell, anything that's inside of the cell is intracellular, and anything that's in this space outside of the cell is extracellular. And then letter B is showing us interstitial fluid. So remember, interstitial fluid is a type of extracellular fluid. It's the fluid that's in the space in between cells, right? Like in the interstate, in between. And these are cells that are making up a single organ or tissue. And then plasma, another type of extracellular fluid, is the fluid specific to blood, right? And then, oh yeah, intracellular fluid, here it is. So intracellular fluid, no, that's what we saw up here. what are we missing? Oh, intravascular fluid, right. So it's not being shown here per se, but in this case, plasma is, we could also say plasma is technically intravascular, right? It's showing capillaries, which is like the tiniest types of blood vessels, but we can also find that intravascular fluid in our lymph vessels as well. And then just a little more about body fluids. So fluid composition of tissue is not always the same. It's not always permanent or constant. The fluid composition of our tissue changes all the time, actually. And then there are some specific factors, I guess, that are going to determine some of that baseline variability of the fluid composition within our tissues. So the type of tissue will influence the fluid composition. So certain tissues have higher fluid content than others, and specifically lean tissue, like muscle tissue, you could think of, has more fluid in it relative to fat tissue. So this actually is important, influences actually body weight and body composition. So again, we'll talk more about this in Unit 4, but two individuals could have a similar body weight, but one person might actually have, but their compositions could be completely different. So someone might actually have more lean tissue and another person might have more fat tissue, but their weight might be the same. And part of that is just because of the greater density of lean tissue, which is in part influenced by the higher fluid content. And then sex and age will also influence tissue fluid composition. So males tend to have more lean tissue relative to females, therefore they tend to have more total body fluid than females. And then with age, as we get older, we tend to lose more body water. So typically as people get older, they lose body water just naturally with age. Also, as we get older, we tend to lose more of our lean tissue mass. And so as we lose more lean tissue, we lose body water that way as well. Okay, doke. So we'll introduce electrolytes here, and then it will be in part 2 of this lecture that we'll actually go through these 4 electrolytes in more detail and talk about food sources and the RDA for each of these micronutrients. So electrolytes, let's give a definition to electrolytes. Electrolytes are substances that when they dissolve in a solution, they dissociate and they become charged particles, electrically charged particles. So that's why they're called electrolytes. So they are these substances that dissolve in water and take on a charge. And we can call charged particles ions, right? We can also further classify ions as either cations or anions. Speaking of cats, my cat wants to join us. So cations are positively charged ions, meaning they take on like a plus, right? A +1 or a +2. And then anions are negatively charged ions. So they have either a -1 or -2 charge. And this is actually referring back to the electrolytes associated with that element. But we won't get into too much of the chemistry here. So for our purposes, what I want you to know is that sodium and chloride are the 2 major cations that we'll learn about, and chloride and phosphorus are the 2 major anions that we'll learn about. And so collectively, these 4 substances or electrolytes help to regulate specifically body fluid throughout the day, throughout our lives. So we're going to talk about how these electrolytes help to regulate body fluid. We'll also talk about a few other roles that they play, like we have some other electrolytes not listed here that help to regulate muscle contraction. Sodium and chloride and potassium also help to regulate nerve impulse transmission. So we're going to talk about how electrolytes help to regulate different body functions. Also, we're going to note that these electrolytes they do move from outside a cell to inside a cell and vice versa, but sodium, chloride, potassium, and phosphorus have like general at-rest locations. So when the body is at rest, we're going to see that sodium and chloride tend to exist in extracellular fluid. So is that inside the cell or outside the cell? Extracellular is outside the cell, so sodium and chloride, we could say, are the major extracellular electrolytes. Sodium is a cation, chloride is an anion. And then we can say that potassium and phosphorus are the major intracellular electrolytes, meaning they're found inside of the cells, inside of cell fluid. Sorry, just trying to manage my cat here because she's going nuts. Okay, so we're going to revisit all of this as we go through each one of these electrolytes. But first, we're going to talk a little bit more about body fluids in general. So we'll talk about some of the functions of body fluid, like why it's important to talk about body fluid. So first of all, fluid is a means of helping us make different substances available to the body for use, right? Like again, glycolysis takes place in the cytosol. So we require fluid environments for our chemical reactions to take place. So in order to actually get the energy from our macronutrients, we require a fluid environment. Blood also, again, is a fluid. It's one of our fluid organs, technically. And so blood is really important as a transport, important for transporting micronutrients and macronutrients throughout the body. So we can say that water is an excellent solvent because it helps to dissolve a lot of different substances. So again, sorry, I have to admit I'm very distracted by my cat. And now she's gone. Okay, so much of the fluid in our body is water-based. So like the fluid in our blood is water-based, the fluid in our cytosol is water-based. So we talked about in digestion and with the macronutrients, specifically carbohydrates and proteins, right? These are water-soluble or hydrophilic molecules, so they can dissolve in water, whereas fat is a hydrophobic molecule, like it can't dissolve in water. So most of the nutrients that we need for health and for survival are actually water soluble, which is helpful because our bodies are so water based. So again, amino acids being the building blocks of protein, glucose being the building block of carbohydrate, many of our vitamins, all of our minerals, and many medications, though not all, are water soluble. So we can easily transport them in the bloodstream. They are pretty easily digested, pretty easily absorbed, pretty easily taken in by different cells of the body. Fat, on the other hand, obviously we still work really well with fat, but we just need a little more help in terms of transporting and assimilating fatty substances. So that's where we talked about the lipoproteins, which are these water-soluble molecules that have a protein portion that can dissolve in the blood, in the water, and then they also have a lipid portion, which can kind of be the carrier for the fatty substance. So one of the functions of body fluid is transportation of substances throughout the body. Another function of body fluid is to protect and lubricate tissues. So on this page, we have listed 6 different body fluids. I've mentioned blood and I've mentioned cytosol so far. So here are some examples of other body fluids. So we have cerebral spinal fluid. So this is a fluid that protects the brain and the spinal cord. We have amniotic fluid in a pregnant person. This is a fluid that's going to protect the fetus. We have synovial fluid that lubricates our joints. We have tears that clean and lubricate our eyes. We have saliva that moistens our food And remember, saliva had a lot of digestive components, bicarbonate, and some digestive enzymes. So it helps moisten the food, and then also is a means of providing those digestive enzymes and other digestive components to help us begin digesting our food. And then we have pleural fluid, which is fluid surrounding the lungs, which again helps the lungs to be fluid and therefore a little more, I guess, supple and mobile so that they can expand and contract without friction. Right? Have you ever felt, as you're inhaling or exhaling, have you felt your lungs, right, moving inside your rib cage? I mean, you can technically, but you don't feel like Velcro or something, right? You can't feel that there's a lot of friction there. So again, all of that. Same with joints. Like if you've ever had any joint issues, sometimes it can be in part due to not enough synovial fluid, right? Where you're actually feeling more of that bone on bone in the joint. So again, fluid in many different parts of our bodies helps to protect and lubricate whatever part of the body it is. And then a third function of body fluids that we'll talk about here is maintaining body temperature. So basically thermoregulation. You might know from like an earth science class or an environment class, or again, also biology, that water has a high capacity for heat, which means that water will more slowly lose heat or gain heat. So anything that has a lot of water in it is sort of a great thermoregulator. Like it helps to moderate intense swings in temperature changes. So one of the mechanisms that we use in our bodies is to regulate body temperature is sweating, because sweating is a release of water, evaporating water from the skin, which allows our skin to cool, and then secondarily allows blood that will travel in the blood vessels close to the skin to also cool. And then as that blood circulates back throughout the body, it's cooler now, so we'll circulate that cool blood through the body and therefore cool ourselves down. So all of that happens because of water and our ability to lose water through the skin. So here's thermoregulation, specifically evaporative cooling. So again, this is looking at your skin, and you can see we've got sweat glands, right? So the sweat glands will secrete water, and as that water just sits then on the surface of our skin, it will evaporate. And then again, blood vessels that are circulating close to this skin, so the skin will cool as the water evaporates. And then any of the blood vessels that are close to the skin are going to cool. The blood in the vessels will cool too. So as that blood returns to systemic circulation, right, it's going to be cooler. And so cool blood is going to flow back to the body core and then back out to other areas of the body and cool us down. So that happens because of water content in our bodies. And then a fourth thing is blood volume. So this is definitely an important job of body fluids. So blood volume influences directly blood pressure. So whenever we're talking about blood volume, we're talking about blood pressure. Well, at least for this lecture. So yeah, body fluid levels maintain blood volume, and blood volume influences blood pressure. So as blood, and it's a direct relationship. So if blood volume goes up, blood pressure goes up. If blood volume goes down, blood pressure goes down. Right? So we can, and we will talk a little more about this at the end of the chapter, but high blood pressure, so if we have high blood volume, that's going to lead to high blood pressure. And we have a name for high blood pressure, which is hypertension. And again, many of us probably know this. It's pretty common in the United States now. But if you don't know hypertension, again, just look at the word hyper, meaning high, And tension, right? If you've ever had if you feel tense, right? Or if you've had a tension headache, maybe it's pressure, right? So it's hypertension, high pressure. So it's high blood pressure. We know that high blood pressure is a risk factor for heart disease, cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart attack, of course. We can also have low blood pressure, which I don't know why it's not written here, but it would be the opposite. It would be hypotension, right? Hypo meaning low. So low blood pressure, that can feel like tiredness. If it's really low, it can be dizziness and also confusion. So we'll take a look at how the kidneys and also how the pituitary gland helps to regulate blood volume and therefore blood pressure. So what we're going to look at here is specifically when blood volume is low, because we have a lot of innate biochemical mechanisms to correct low blood volume. And we do have some mechanisms to correct high blood volume, but in this lecture, we're going to focus a lot more on the mechanisms that correct low blood volume. So if we have low blood volume, and think about when might we have low blood volume? Why would we ever have not enough fluid in the blood, right? Could be due to excessive exercise, right? Excessive sweating, could be due to dehydration, could also be due to traumatic, like physical injury where you've lost a lot of blood, or potentially donating blood and giving too much blood away. So anything that might lead to low blood volume is going to lead to low blood pressure. I'm abbreviating blood pressure VP. So when we have low blood volume, several things are going to happen. One of the things that's going to happen is that the pituitary gland up in our brain, right, is going to sense this low blood volume and release something called antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is then going to travel to the kidneys and tell the kidneys to reabsorb water from the kidneys. So decreasing the amount of water that's going out in the urine, right? So as we decrease urine output, we're holding on to water, that's going to allow our blood pressure to go back up because that water is going to get reabsorbed and go back into circulation, back into the blood. So also look at this word antidiuretic, right? If you know what the word diuretic means, and you might not, but diuretic means something that increases urine output, something that causes us to create urine to go pee, basically. So if it's an antidiuretic, it's going to have the opposite effect of a diuretic. So antidiuretic means reducing urine output. And anytime we reduce urine output, it necessarily means we're reabsorbing that water back into the body. So it necessarily means we're going to reabsorb that water back into our blood and thereby increase our blood volume and our blood pressure. Another system that goes on here, I'll change my color, I guess. So maybe this, yeah. So the kidney and the pituitary gland, maybe I should have made the title a little differently. The kidneys obviously have a major role in regulating blood volume, but the pituitary does support by releasing this antidiuretic hormone. But then the kidneys can also act directly. So the kidneys can release an enzyme called renin, and renin will be released into the blood, and renin is an enzyme, so its job is going to be to like facilitate other reactions. So what renin does is it works with a protein that's naturally in the blood called angiotensinogen. Renin is going to help sort of activate angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, and then angiotensin 1 will get further activated to something called angiotensin 2. And then angiotensin 2 is going to work kind of in concert with antidiuretic hormone. Its job is, one of its jobs is to act as a vasoconstrictor, so decreasing the circumference of the blood vessel. So vaso meaning vascular, meaning the vessel, and constrict meaning to constrict or make smaller. So if we make the blood vessel smaller, right? So here's maybe a normal sized blood vessel. If we make it smaller, but you have the same amount of fluid pumping through, right? Which one is going to have a higher pressure? The smaller one. So vasoconstriction increases blood pressure. So again, the end goal here, whenever blood pressure is low, the end goal is to increase blood pressure. So angiotensin 2 doesn't necessarily affect blood volume, but affects blood pressure. And so angiotensin 2 does that by vasoconstricting the blood vessels, making it such that there's less space for the blood to flow through, thereby helping to increase blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 will also signal the release of another hormone called aldosterone. This one gets released from the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys. Aldosterone acts on the kidneys to tell the kidneys to, assuming ADH has been active, the kidneys are already reabsorbing more water. And now aldosterone is telling the kidneys to also retain more sodium and chloride. We haven't quite talked about this yet, but the water is going to follow these ions. So as the kidneys reabsorb more sodium and chloride, they're going to reabsorb more water, which again decreases urine output, puts more water back in the blood, increases blood volume, and increases blood pressure. Again, I'm sorry, I erased what figure this was from your book, but this is a figure, like a visual representation of everything we've just talked about. So in both cases, this is when blood pressure is low and blood volume is low. So one of the ways yeah, that's not written here. So let me just go back here. Yeah, it's not written here, but we said that the pituitary gland responds to low blood volume. Specifically, actually, the pituitary gland is responding to the hypothalamus, noticing that there's increased solute concentration in the blood. So as there's increased solute concentration in the blood, that means that there's too much stuff in the blood relative to the amount of fluid in the blood. So you don't necessarily need to know that for our purposes, but that is specifically what stimulates the release of antidiuretic hormone from the pituitary gland. But again, everything else here is going to be the same as what we've talked about on these previous two slides. So antidiuretic hormone is going to tell the kidneys to reabsorb more water. Antidiuretic, the opposite of diuretic. So urine output will go down and blood volume will go up. And as blood volume goes up, that helps to reestablish more normal concentration of blood fluid relative to blood solute. And then on the right-hand side is looking at that angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, and aldosterone, those pathways. So again, with decreased blood volume, that means we have decreased blood pressure. The kidneys are going to secrete renin. Renin is basically going to convert angiotensinogen ultimately to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2, we talked about two functions of angiotensin 2. One was the vasoconstriction. The other was the signaling of the release of aldosterone from the adrenal glands. And aldosterone's job, again, was to reabsorb these two major ions, which causes water to follow. So water is reabsorbed. Again, ultimately, all three of these are having the same effect, which is to increase blood volume or increase blood pressure. I guess I should say specifically blood pressure, because vasoconstriction doesn't directly influence blood volume. Okay, so then we've just been talking about body fluids, and we've talked about how body fluids help establish blood volume and blood pressure. Body fluids help manage thermoregulation. body fluids protect and lubricate, and body fluid helps with transportation of substances throughout the body. So now we're going to talk about electrolytes specifically. So remember, this lecture is kind of about fluid and electrolytes. So these next several slides are going to focus on electrolytes. And we said that electrolytes are these substances that dissolve in water, and when they dissolve in water, they dissociate and become electrically charged, either a positive or a negative charge. And those electrical charges can help regulate several different functions of the body. So one of the systems that electrolytes can help regulate is also fluid balance. And we saw that right here when we said that aldosterone causes the kidneys to reabsorb sodium and chloride. Remember, sodium and chloride are two of our electrolytes. Sodium is one of our major cations, has a positive charge. Chloride is one of our major anions, has a negative charge. And so what they do is, as they get reabsorbed, water follows. So oftentimes, water is going to follow these electrolytes. So as they get reabsorbed, we reabsorb more water, we bring our blood pressure back up. So one of the ways this, I guess how this is possible, we could say, is that cell membranes are permeable to water, but not freely permeable to electrolytes. And it gets a bit more complicated in the kidneys. We won't go into much detail in this course about kidney permeability to different substances, but so we can't always directly control the flow of water, but we generally can control the flow of electrolytes. So by controlling the flow of electrolytes, we can control the flow of water. We're going to kind of review briefly this concept of osmosis, which is where water moves somewhat freely, right? But based on solute concentration. So water moves according to solute concentration. And specifically, water moves from areas of high concentration, water will move from an area of low solute concentration, meaning high water concentration, to an area of high solute concentration, meaning water concentration is low. I've got a picture on the next slide, so if I just confuse anyone, hopefully we'll straighten it out on the next slide. Again, this is all a means of regulating the movement of water. So again, we don't directly influence water movement. We can influence electrolyte movement, and then water will follow. There's this concept of osmotic pressure, which I won't expect you to know for our course necessarily, but osmotic pressure is this pressure that keeps electrolytes that are in solution from drawing fluid towards them if there is a semi-permeable membrane. So it's sort of this, let's look at this slide. This will help make a lot more sense. So we can talk about osmosis and osmotic pressure here. So in the first image, we have, we're not going to count all these dots, but let's assume these dots are electrolytes, or they could even be proteins. But for our purposes today, let's call them electrolytes. So these substances in the water. And so it looks like on the left and the right, we have an equal amount of substance in the water. And then you can see by the water line, we have an equal amount of water on either side. So these two sides are in balance. Because there's equal amount of solute on either side, there's equal amount of water. And we're going to say that these membranes down the middle, we're going to say that these are semi-permeable membranes. So in image B, as we add salt, which is sodium chloride, right? As we add salt to the right side, we start to increase the solute concentration over here. So we can now, especially as we get to C, this is just the progression, we can say that the left side is going to have low solute concentration relative to the right side is going to have high solute concentration. So if osmosis is the movement of water from low solute concentration to high solute concentration, where would we expect the water to move? Is the water going to move from the left side to the right side or the right side to the left side? Going from low solute to high solute. So we're going to expect the water, see the water level here, water is going to move this way. Water is going to move from left to right, and you can see that represented by this increased amount of water on the right side. So this right here, the ability for the water to stay high, like this is a semi-permeable membrane, like water can obviously move across this membrane, but the fact that the water will stay higher over here than over here is this concept of osmotic pressure. But because there are so many electrolytes in the solution on the right side here, there's so much sodium chloride over here that it actually holds the water, even though there's basically a membrane that water could pass across. So this osmotic pressure keeps the water there because there's enough electrolyte there to hold the water. So it's osmosis and osmotic pressure. And so then on this slide, we kind of put all of that together in some real life examples. So let's start all the way at the top. So our body's cells, the health of our body's cells depend on proper fluid balance as well as electrolyte balance on both sides of the cell membrane, both at rest and during exercise. So in these three examples, we're going to look at moderate exercise, then we're going to look at strenuous exercise with rapid and high water intake, and then we're going to look at strenuous exercise with inadequate fluid intake. So at moderate exercise, assuming somebody is appropriately hydrated, it's not too hot, the concentration of electrolytes is likely to be the same on both sides of the cell. So we can talk about intracellular and extracellular fluid, right? Surprised they don't write that. But anything that's inside of this cell would be intracellular, right? And anything that's anything in the outside would be in the extracellular space or extracellular fluid. And so in this case, they're suggesting that there's an equal concentration of electrolytes inside and outside the cell. So what would the water do then? Which image here are we talking about for the water? Which image of the glasses is kind of represented by this? Image A would be, right? You've got equal amounts of electrolyte inside the cell and outside the cell. We can pretend that this is inside and this is outside. Okay, so it's equal, so the water stays where it is. And then in the second picture, we're looking at strenuous exercise. So during intense, prolonged exercise, the extracellular fluid is going to become diluted. Well, I skipped over the first line. Okay. So I think it's worth noting, though, that we start with intense and prolonged exercise, right? So probably, you're breathing really hard, you're sweating really hard, and maybe you're doing that for 45 minutes or an hour. And this person drinks a great deal of water very quickly during the exercise or maybe right after. So where is that water going to go first, right? The water is going to be outside the cell, because as we drink water, right, it goes down our esophagus into our stomach, we absorb it into the blood, but before it gets to our muscle cells or any other cells, it's going to be in the extracellular fluid outside the cell. So what happens is then the concentration of electrolytes inside the cell will be greater. I should use a highlighter, I guess. The concentration of electrolytes inside the cell will be greater than the concentration of electrolytes outside the cell. So then what happens? Which one of these images are we going to see? Which one of these concepts are we going to see, right? If we have a lot more water, a lot more electrolyte inside the cell than outside, right? It's actually going to be kind of like this one, image C over here. Sorry, it's a lot to erase. So we're going to see that what's represented here, higher concentration of electrolytes inside the cell, that would be kind of like this. This would be like inside the cell. This would kind of be like outside the cell. So we're going to see water is going to rush into the cell, right? That's what we see. So, which causes water to enter the cell, making the cell swell. And then they go on to say that drinking moderate amounts of water or sports drink more slowly would replace the fluids and restore fluid balance. So in part, this was because she drank the water quickly. It was also because she drank a lot of water quickly. And then in the bottom case, we have strenuous exercise, but not enough fluid intake. So in this case, the person is, again, exercising really intensely, probably for several hours. And so in that time, the concentration of electrolytes outside of the cell becomes greater. So higher concentration of electrolytes outside, because these cells have been working so hard for so long, and they've been losing water. And they should have shown that up here, because this had also happened first here. And then this person drank a ton of water, diluted the concentration outside, and so forced this rapid influx inside. So in this case, we've got, no water's coming in, So the concentration of electrolytes outside the cell is going to become much greater relative to inside the cell. And so then, so what happens then is that water is going to continually follow those electrolytes, and this is going to cause the cell to shrink and kind of shrivel up a little bit. Again, we can correct this by consuming a sports drink, which replaces both fluids and electrolytes and would ultimately help to restore electrolyte balance inside and outside the cell, which would then restore the water balance inside and outside the cell. So what I and the book want you to take away from this slide is this difference between when the cell swells versus when the cell shrinks, right? So it just depends on whether the high concentration of the electrolyte is inside the cell or outside the cell. If the high concentration of electrolyte is inside the cell, water is going to follow. Water is always going to go where the electrolytes are higher. So when we've exercised intensely and then consumed a ton of water rapidly, that's going to cause the cells to swell. Whereas if we've exercised intensely and not replenished any water, that's going to cause the cells to shrink. And it would be nice if maybe there was a fourth image here, which would take us back up here, but where somebody might be exercising intensely, but also consuming an electrolyte-enhanced water beverage that provides water and electrolytes and allows this perfect harmonious balance to exist, right? So anyway, review this so that you can get a sense for what causes the cell to swell, what causes the cell to shrink, and understanding why. So a little more about this concept of fluid balance, right? How do we get fluid, first of all, right? We don't just always maintain the same amount of fluid in our bodies. So we have to actually consume fluid. We do make a little bit of water through metabolic pathways. Remember when we talked about dehydration synthesis? We pull water out of some of the molecules so that we can join the two together. Like we saw if we join two glucose molecules together, we actually have to do this process of dehydration synthesis. So sometimes we generate a little bit of water just through metabolic processes, but primarily the real fluid intake, the real fluid gain is through consuming it. So yeah, basically our fluid needs need to be met by consuming beverages and also consuming water-rich food. Metabolic water contributes about 10 to 14% of the total body water needs each day. So how do we manage this part? How do we manage the intake of fluid? Well, again, it's regulated by the brain, the hypothalamus in this case. The hypothalamus has what we might call like a thirst center or a thirst mechanism. So similar to how the same thing that we talked about with blood volume regulation, the hypothalamus will detect sodium concentrations in the blood as well as other solute concentration in the blood. And if it notices that there's an increased solute concentration, that's going to stimulate the thirst mechanism, where we're then going to become conscious of being thirsty, having low body water, and we'll be stimulated, encouraged to drink water. So part of that process would be sensing a dry mouth and a dry throat from reduced saliva. These in the middle here would be kind of severe cases of being like really dehydrated. So profuse sweating, vomiting, diarrhea. Going back to low blood volume, vomiting and diarrhea would also cause low blood volume and low blood pressure. And then of course, like just not consuming enough fluid would lead to dehydration. And so any of these things are going to lead to high solute concentration in the blood, which is going to signal the hypothalamus to say, oh, we don't have enough fluid in the body because there's too much solute concentration in the blood, so we need to drink more fluid to reestablish that solute fluid balance in the blood. And then also, antidiuretic hormone is going to act, as we saw, and encourage the kidneys to retain water if there's not enough body water, if blood volume is low effectively. So still on this theme of low blood volume, there are two different types of fluid loss that we can talk about. We can talk about sensible fluid loss. So these are noticeable ways in which we lose blood volume or we lose fluid from the body. So sensible meaning noticeable. Whenever we urinate, whenever we go pee, we're obviously getting rid of some fluid in our urine. Also sweating during exercise or just on a particularly hot day or hot, humid environment. We'll notice that we are sweating, that we are losing some water through the skin. Insensible fluid loss is fluid loss that we don't perceive as much. Like we're actually continually losing little bits of water through the skin. We just don't always notice it unless we're sweating profusely. And then respiration. So as we breathe, we lose water in that process of respiration, specifically on the exhale. And then there's yet a third way that we lose fluid from the body. It doesn't necessarily fit into sensible or insensible, although some of them, I guess, would be pretty noticeable or pretty obvious. But if we do have a traumatic injury where a lot of blood is lost, that's going to decrease fluid volume. Oftentimes, illness is going to lead to fluid loss, just to increased metabolic activity to fight off whatever the infection might be. We said blood donation is obviously going to remove a significant amount of blood from the body, so that will be fluid loss. Surgery can lead to fluid loss. Again, exercise can lead to fluid loss. High altitude and low humidity, so like really arid climates, and also high altitude lead to more water loss relative to more moderate humidity and lower altitude. Pregnancy increases water loss. Breastfeeding Breast milk is fluid. There's a lot of water loss happening there. So these are 2 times to increased fluid intake. And then, of course, diuretics. Diuretics cause fluid loss. So anyone taking a diuretic is going to see regular fluid loss. So any of these are leading to more significant fluid loss than just sensible and insensible fluid loss. But of course, in any of these cases where there is fluid loss, we do need to replace it. Insensible and sensible fluid loss are basically pretty much happening all the time, any day, which means we need to continually be replenishing our body fluid by consuming water. Alrighty, so still on this topic of the functions of electrolytes. So far, we've only said that electrolytes help maintain body fluid balance because wherever the electrolytes go, water follows. So if we have high electrolyte concentration in the body, we are going to absorb more water, retain more water. If we're losing a lot of electrolytes, like through sweating or through increased urination, we're likely to lose more body fluid because the water is going to follow the electrolytes. So this is a second function of electrolytes, nerve impulse transmission. So basically how nerves respond to stimuli and basically communicate from one to another, and ultimately, in most cases, communicate to a muscle or an organ. So nerve impulses are basically these electrical charges that travel down the neuron. So if you took anatomy and physiology, or physiology specifically, you might know the process of depolarization, reaching the action potential, and then repolarizing. Sodium and potassium are 2 of the electrolytes that are most notable in this process. So let's take a look. We will also see chloride, though, often assisting in nerve impulse transmission. So at the resting state, and I don't necessarily need you to memorize any of this for our purposes, but can be helpful to just understand it a little more deeply so that you'll hopefully remember that these electrolytes are supporting this whole electrical impulse that is communication of neurons in our bodies. So at the resting state, we have basically equal amounts of positive, well, it's not actually totally balanced, but we have what we call a homeostatic state. So we have specific amounts of anions and cations outside the cell in the extracellular space, and specific amounts of anions and cations inside the cell in the intracellular space. So as a nerve starts to communicate starts to create this electrical impulse to communicate with the next neuron, we see this process of depolarization of the cell. So depolarizing, where it becomes less polar. So if we go back to the first image, you'll notice if you look at the amounts of pluses and minuses, anions and cations, inside and outside the cell, you'll notice there's a lot more anion inside the cell. So it's actually a more negative environment inside the cell, and it's actually a more positive environment outside the cell. So as we depolarize, right, so we could say that in image A, at the resting state, we could actually say that this is a very polar environment, because these are polar opposites, positive and negative. So in depolarization, we become less polar. So what we're going to see is movement of these cations, specifically sodium, coming into the cell. And now we see that inside the cell is a much more positive environment. So that's how we generate this electrical stimulus, is just by the movement of these electrically charged particles. And so that's how we would see this cascade of depolarization going down the whole cell, ultimately reaching what we call an action potential. Then there's neurotransmitter release. And then ultimately after that, we repolarize the cell, where we reestablish this polarization, where it's more negative inside and it's more positive outside. And that is done in part, you can see, by these potassium ions actually moving back out of the cell to help establish a more positive environment outside of the cell. So that's why these are also often called sodium-potassium channels, sodium-potassium pumps, is because primarily this electrical signal is generated by movement of sodium and potassium. So again, this is happening because of our electrolytes. And then a third function of electrolytes is to facilitate muscle contraction. And in this case, we haven't introduced calcium yet, but it is actually calcium primarily that helps to initiate these muscle contractions. We will also see some sodium-potassium channels in the overall process, particularly when the neuromuscular neuron reaches the muscle tissue. But in the actual muscle tissue itself, in the actual muscle cell, we're going to see action of calcium ions. So in this case, we do consider calcium to be an electrolyte. We'll also see that one of the common neurotransmitters that initiates muscle contraction is acetylcholine. And you might remember in chapter 8, we introduced acetylcholine with the B vitamins, being a molecule that contains choline, right? Yep, so basically, I do have an image over here. So there's a lot going on here, and you're welcome to spend some time with this image if you want to. But the main thing that we're looking at is, I guess, right here. So I'll start at the top briefly, but I'm not going to go in a lot of detail. But here, this is actually, right, the end of a neuron. And so this action potential was reached, right? We went from resting state, we depolarized, we reached an action potential. This is the abbreviation for acetylcholine. So this neurotransmitter acetylcholine was released and now is binding to this muscle cell. And the binding of acetylcholine to the muscle cell causes the release of calcium stored within the cell. Calcium is going to bind. You might remember that muscle tissue has these two fibers, right? Actin and myosin. So basically what calcium does is it binds to this, this thing called troponin, which makes the binding sites available so that actin and myosin can bind to each other and cause this muscle contraction. So this is in contraction. Calcium makes the binding sites available. Actin and myosin can bind to each other and can contract. You'll notice in the relaxation on the left, you'll notice that calcium is starting to go back into storage. And if you look closely, this is maybe a nicer image to see, this troponin, this kind of orangey line, is basically blocking those binding sites on the little myosin, on the little actin strands. So going back over here, you'll notice that the binding sites are open and can bind to the myosin head. But when calcium is no longer available, the binding sites get basically closed off so that the muscle fibers can relax. So this is a third function of electrolytes in the body, is muscle contraction, and that's done in large part due to calcium, which we consider an electrolyte in this example. Okay, I'll say a little more about how much water we should drink, and then I will end here for part 1. So the amount of water that we need varies all the time. That's a common answer in nutrition, right? There's never a set amount that we need. So our water needs are going to vary with age, body size, health, physical activity, and again, the environment, whether it's high altitude, very arid. Yep, athletes and people who are highly active or working in really hot environments need additional fluid replacement on top of baseline recommendations. Water can be from tap water, bottled water. It can come from carbonated like seltzer water, as long as it's unsweetened. Distilled water is not recommended for drinking. And then we'll also see like fruits and vegetables provide a little bit of water, fresh fruits and vegetables. But primarily when we're talking about consuming water as a fluid, it's coming from plain pure water itself. So one of the ways we can figure out how much water we need is to measure how much water we lose. Most of us aren't going to be going about measuring water loss every day, though. But you can see on the right, how do we lose water? Again, through urine, through peeing, again, through skin and sweat, and also through respiration. And then also in our stool, we're losing some water in our stool. So in research, we have actually measured roughly on average how much water does get lost through urine, skin and respiration, and feces on a given day. And we estimate that it's around 3 liters, 3,000 milliliters. So then we could say like a rough ballpark, our water requirement for the day is 3 liters. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the various sources from which we get water per day. So a little bit comes from food, even less comes from metabolic reactions. And so the majority of it needs to come from our beverages, right? And not all food provides the same amount of water. So here it suggests that we can get about 2 cups of water from food, but that would be somebody who's actually eating, 2 cups of fruit, 2.5 cups of vegetables a day, eating cooked beans. Yeah, but somebody who might be eating chips and French fries and hamburgers all day and not fruit and vegetable probably will not get 2 cups of water from their food. So then they would need to increase their water intake through beverages. This is mostly showing fruits and vegetables, but water content of different foods. It's not telling you how much water, it's just telling you the percentage of the food that is water. So lettuce and cucumbers, maybe 2 obviously very water-rich foods. Again, peaches, pineapple, even a sweet potato. And then you can see like a lean pork chop that was broiled still contains a bit of water. So this is how we could amount to about 2 cups of water from food. Okay, I guess it isn't actually ever written out. So 3 liters is kind of a ballpark. The National Academy of Sciences, they write the dietary reference intake values, remember. Their baseline is 2.7 liters per day. That's for females. And they actually recommend 3.7 liters per day, and that's for males. And that again is baseline. If we come back, and down here you can see 3 liters is about 12.5 cups, right? So 3.7 liters is more than 13 cups. 2.7 liters is probably less than 12 cups. And then again, people who are super active and or working in hot environments need additional fluids beyond these levels up here, right? This is baseline. This is also more than that old adage of 8 8-ounce cups a day. 8 8-ounce cups a day is only 64 ounces. 64 ounces, I think, is about 2 liters. So it's quite a bit more than that we need per day. And then again, with exercise on top of it, or if the environment is hot or arid, we need even more. Again, beverages that can provide water and or be healthy. So many beverages, this says many beverages can provide health benefits and potential nutrient concerns. So yeah, we guess we could go through all of these. Any caffeine containing beverages, like these are so popular these days, right? Like energy drinks and sports drinks, Red Bulls, Monsters, all that jazz. be very careful because a lot of them have other additives that are not particularly healthful. Milk and milk substitutes, when they're plain and unsweetened, these can be very helpful. You do want to look out for the fat content, and then you want to look out for any sweetener that might be added. Same with coffee and tea. If you're having black coffee or plain tea unsweetened, these are very healthy, very good sources of, well, tea can be a source of water, but coffee has caffeine, which can be a diuretic. Cocoa, of course, can be a source of a lot of extra fat, a lot of extra sugar. Many specialty waters might be flavored with extra sugar or an artificial sweetener. And then also sports beverages and coconut water also have usually a lot of sweetener. So be careful with your beverage choices because they might appear to be healthy, but really when you look behind the scenes, you're getting a lot of extra calories or a lot of potentially harmful substances otherwise. Also with sports beverages, I see a lot of overuse of them. I would say somebody doesn't really need a sports beverage as a replacement for electrolytes unless they've worked out really, really hard for like at least 45 minutes. Below that, I don't know, it's sort of questionable. We can't really say that there's a cut and dry line above this and below this you do or don't need electrolyte replacement, but I find that people are taking an electrolyte replacement just because they went on a walk, for example. But really we don't need a sports beverage replacement unless we've had pretty excessive sweating. Alrighty, and then this will be the last slide for part 1 of chapter 9. So in here, we kind of throw in acid-base balance. I think it's just 1 page in your textbook in all of chapter 9. But because we're talking about fluid balance, I think it's a worthwhile place to also throw in blood pH balance. So we've mentioned blood pH a little bit, especially when we talked about the acidity of the stomach. We said that blood pH, we want to maintain blood pH between 7.35 and 7.45, which is actually slightly alkaline. So if blood comes above that and becomes more basic, right, takes up more hydrogen ions, that becomes a problem. Also, if the blood becomes too acidic and has fewer hydrogen ions, that becomes, well, actually the blood would have more hydrogen ions. That also becomes a problem. So now you don't really need to be able to differentiate acids and bases for our purpose, but an acid is something that gives out hydrogen ions. So if the blood becomes acidic, there's probably more acidic substances in the blood that are releasing hydrogen ions into solution. So we're going to see actually a low pH, but a high concentration of hydrogen ions. Bases are the opposite. Bases actually take hydrogen ions out of solution. So we're going to see a decrease in hydrogen ions floating around, and that means that pH goes up. So how do our bodies regulate the acid-base balance in the blood? So the 2 major ways are blood buffers and respiratory compensation. Blood buffers are basically things that are in the blood that can kind of easily go between an acid state and a basic state. So proteins are one type of blood buffer. There's also the bicarbonate carbonic acid system. And so in bicarbonate, if I'm saying this right, bicarbonate can dissociate either to carbon dioxide and hydrogen, or can dissociate to, this I believe is carbonic acid in the middle, or can dissociate into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. And so if we have, depending on the nature of the blood, if it's too acidic or too basic, this molecule can either move in this direction or move in this direction, right? So generally, if we have a really acidic environment in the blood for whatever reason, this reaction is going to flow in this direction and decrease the amount of hydrogen ions in the blood. Similarly, if the blood is too basic, this reaction is going to flow in this direction and increase the amount of hydrogen ions in the blood. So blood buffers is one system of regulating acid-base balance. Then there's also respiratory compensation, basically how our respiratory system, our blood and our lungs, will work together to manage acid-base balance. So basically, the respiratory system can either hyperventilate, meaning very fast respiration, or it can slow down respiration. And so part of this is because when we exhale a lot, we get rid of carbon dioxide, and so we can start to shift the acid-base balance in the blood to become more basic. So we hyperventilate when the blood is really acidic. So when we have too much hydrogen ion in the blood. And so by hyperventilating, we can help decrease the amount of hydrogen ions in the blood. In the reverse way, if the blood is too basic, meaning there's too much bicarbonate in the blood, or alkaline, then if we slow down respiration, we exhale less, meaning there's going to be more CO2 in the blood, which will result in, which will push this reaction to the right, resulting in more hydrogen ions in the blood, helping to bring the pH back up, making it more neutral. And then there's a last option for acid-base balance, which is how the kidneys can compensate. And again, we really only see renal compensation for acid-base balance if, well, in a few severe, we see it in severe situations, I guess is what I want to say here. So again, for our class, we won't really talk in detail about renal compensation for acid-base balance, but it is a third way that the body can help to maintain this pH balance of the blood, usually under severe circumstances. Okay, so yeah, when we pick up in part 2 of this lecture, we're going to go through sodium, potassium, chloride, and phosphorus, and talk about each of these minerals unto themselves, food sources for these minerals, and then we'll also talk about several issues associated, like diseases or disorders of the body associated with electrolyte imbalances and fluid imbalances. Alrighty, so thanks for listening to part 1, and we will see you for part 2.